Okay now.
Yeah. All right. We are good. I think we can let folks in.
Do you want me to do it?
Yep.
It looks okay. And you'll tell me when should I keep sharing it while I'm speaking?
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. I don't know if I can do that and still see my notes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We apologize for the delay. Had some technical issues, but we're so glad that you're here with us today. That's fine, Lisa. Go ahead.
Okay. Should I get started?
Sure.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Del Sesto, and I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas at the Bender JCC of Greater Washington and Rockville, Maryland. And we're thrilled to partner this evening with the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks to bring you this very special Yom Hashoah program featuring author Judy Batalion. This program is presented as part of the Bender JCC's Lessons Family Literary Series, and I want to take a moment to thank our benefactors, Stu and Ellen Lessons, for generously naming this series. Without their support, we would not be able to present literary programs such as this one. It is also presented as part of the Literatur Berks, a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter community and the Jewish Book Council. Before we begin our program with Judy Batalion tonight, we want to take a few moments to commemorate Yom Hashoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this day, we recall the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. As Elie Wiesel said, for in the end, it is all about memory, its sources, its magnitude, and of course, its consequences. And now I would like to introduce the Bender JCC's Community Shlicha, our emissary from Israel, Naama Kadosh, to read a memorial prayer.
Thank you, Lisa. אל מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, הימצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. את נשמות כל אחינו ואחיותינו הקדושים והטהורים, שהומתו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. יהיה הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Tonight, we light the 6 memorial candles in memory of the 6 million Jews and all others who died in the Holocaust. Let us honor those whose lights were put out, whose dreams, hopes, and lives were cut off. Let us pray together in hope to learn to live in peace and to help build a world that has no room for hatred, no place for violence. O God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me and from my anguish warring? My God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night and have no respite. But you are the Holy One, enthroned the praise of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and rescued them. To you they cried out, and they escaped. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. And now I'd like to invite our local Holocaust survivor, Mariette Jacobson, to light our memorial candles.
Thank you to my son, Jack.
Thank you, Mariette. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Amanda.
Lisa, you can actually stop the screen share. Thank you. I'm thrilled to welcome Judy Batalion to our program. Judy is the author of the brand new book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos. She's also the author of White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. She's been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Forward, Vogue, and many other publications. She's a BA in the history of science from Harvard and a PhD in the history of art from the University of London. And she's worked as a museum curator and university lecturer. And I know that your book just came out, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you so much for hosting me. I'm really pleased to be here.
So this is a story. I've been in Holocaust education for almost a decade. I've never heard most of these stories, and I'm sure that most people here tonight have not heard these stories. So how did you find this story?
Sure. So I found this story, my original inspiration for this, 14 years ago this week. So this has been, as someone called it today, an odyssey in the making. And I found this story by accident. As many creative projects begin by mistake. I was living in London at the time, and I myself am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I was exploring my Jewish identity at the time, and I was writing about it. And I was very interested in what I always call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passes through generations. And in particular, I was thinking about in my own life, my own reactions to danger and how my heritage sort of influenced or shaped how I handled things that felt dangerous. And I decided to write a performance piece about this, about strong Jewish women who had confronted danger. And the first one to come to mind was Hana Senisch. She was someone I had studied in 5th grade, and her story had stayed with me. And for those who don't know Hana Senisch, she was a young Hungarian Jew who had moved to what was then Palestine before the war. And during World War II, she decided she wanted to fight back, and she joined the Allied services and the forces and became a paratrooper and went back to Nazi-occupied Europe. And I'd always learned about her as a hero, a symbol of Jewish courage. But I wanted to understand not just Hana Senisch, the hero, but Hana Senisch, the person. Who does that? Who goes back to fight the Nazis? What's her psychology? What kind of person acts like that? So I decided to do some research on Hana Senisch. I went to the British Library. I looked her up in their catalog, and I ordered whatever books they had. They did not have very many books at the British Library on Hana Senisch. But one of the books that I got was an unusual book. It was an old kind of dusty book with a fabric cover. And it was also in Yiddish. And it was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But even more unusual than this book was the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I was able to read it, and I started flipping through this strange treasure and looking for Hana Senisch, but she's nowhere to be found. She's only the last few pages. In front of her, there's dozens and dozens of names of Jewish women with photos and little stories of other young Jewish women who defied the Nazis, who blew up German supply trains, who were weapons couriers. The chapters were things like partisan combat and ammunition. I was stunned. As you said, this was not a story I had ever come across. Myself, I grew up in a Holocaust survivor family and community, and it was not a side of the story I'd ever heard. And that's how it all began. That's my long answer.
That's amazing. That's what I love about research and libraries. You just go in thinking one thing, and then you find a clue, or you just find something that catches your eye, and you just go down this completely new trail. And it's amazing. I love it. I love it. Where does the title come from? The Light of Days.
Yeah, that's a great
in the book,
question.
and I just found it so interesting.
So there's a few answers, and that's why it sucked. There was a lot of discussion around title, as there often is with books, and a lot of people were involved. And we decided a nice idea would be to take a title to look at songs and poems from the time and see if we could find a lyric that felt right. And it dawned on me in this original Yiddish book that then became the inspiration for my book. There were a few poems. So I went back and looked at them. And this line, The Light of Days, was from one of those poems. It was written by a young Jewish girl. She did not survive, but it was about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was part of a ghetto song contest. There were a lot of creative contests and competitions in the ghettos. And she wrote this song about how Warsaw right now was being decimated, but she saw the resistance happening, and Warsaw would one day again see the light of days. And it felt powerful and so appropriate. So that became the title, but there are other reasons too. One of the other reasons is that in many of these memoirs and testimonies that I read, and I read dozens and dozens and dozens of them, women often, they talked about their craving. They were hungry, they were very thirsty, which was very difficult to read. But the other thing that they craved often was daylight. Many of these women were in the underground, and they were literally underground for large chunks of time. And they wrote about this craving. Oh, I can't wait till one day I can see sunlight again. And I found that very moving. And I think that's part of part of the reason as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, that symbolism of light and finding, and the actual light that they were craving during that time.
Yeah.
So in the book, you write about all types of Jewish women and non-Jewish women. But can you talk about some of the characteristics of these couriers and other Jewish resistance workers? I mean, was there did they come from a particular background? Did they have common traits that said, yes, you're going to be in the resistance, or was there nothing that was a common thread?
So I have a few answers to this. So the first answer is many of the people that I write about in this book came from, they were part of organized resistance that was organized through, originally these were youth movements. And they were members of youth movements. In Poland in the 30s, a large number of Jewish youths were part of these movements. They had different political and social and different principles and philosophies. And many of the women I write about were from socialist, secular youth movements. Some were Zionists, some were Bundists. So they came to it with their values of collaboration and equality and collectivism. Now I forget what I was answering. What was your question?
About the background of that. Was there a common, rich, poor, secular,
right.
not, religious?
So the people that I'm writing about were mostly secular. Some of them were religious. Some of them were traditional, more than religious, I think. A few of them came from religious backgrounds. Some of them came from poverty, but many of them were middle class. They were young middle class Jews.
I was struck by their age. I mean, these were not, you call them girls, and then in the conclusion, you kind of apologize for using girls because they really were young women, but they were young. I mean, we're talking, teenagers or young 20s, and they were really taking charge and doing things that in many cases their elders were unable or unwilling to do.
Most of the women that I write about were between the ages of 16 and 25. And my central character, Renia, was 18 years old for the time that she was in the underground doing undercover missions for the underground.
That's just amazing to me to think that, these young women had what they accomplished at that age. You mentioned that a lot of them were members of these youth groups and the Zionist movement. Anybody who knows a little bit about Jewish history in Poland, in the interwar years or during the war, realized that those youth groups, there was a lot of competition between the groups. Did they get along during the war when there was a common enemy, or were there still fractions and frictions during that time?
So that's a great question. And it depends. Mostly they did not get along, and it took work to get these different Jewish youth groups together and to collaborate. In a place like Vilna, they kind of immediately, the underground was really a collaboration, and it had leaders from different factions. And they did work together more so than in most places, and much more than in Warsaw. And in Warsaw, it took time and effort to bring people onto the same page.
Was there, an issue of gender within the groups as well? How did that play out?
I think that women were able to perform certain roles in the underground much more easily than men. So things sort of became divided based on what role you could do. I mean, these were extremely, extremely difficult, tense times. So, there was a desperation. People did what they could. Many of the women that I write about, they were, the underground work that they did, the reason they were able to be part of the resistance, or what they had to leave the ghettos. They had to be able to they connected ghettos, they were smugglers, they had to go out to sabotage trains. And in order to leave the ghetto, of course, you had to appear non-Jewish. They had to pass as being Christian Polish girls. And for women, this was easier than for men. First of all, women were not circumcised. So they didn't have a physical marker on their body of their Jewishness. And that was a problem for men. If someone suspected a man of being Jewish, they would literally tell him to drop his pants. And this was an issue. Women didn't have that. Women also in 1930s Poland, which has become a favorite time period for me, because it's so interesting and I feel under-discussed as well. Women, education was mandatory in Poland for boys and girls up through 8th grade, and women went to school. But often, Jewish families would send their boys to Jewish schools, and they sent their girls to public school. And in these public schools, the girls developed skill. They developed a comfort around Christian Poles. They were aware of their mannerisms, of their habits, of their holidays, of their prayers. They also learned to speak Polish, as they say in their writings constantly, like a Pole, without the creaky Yiddish accent. And so women were able to disguise themselves. They had more tools to be able to do that. And that's why they took on those roles in particular in the underground.
You mentioned a little bit some of the roles that they took on. Can you explain, part of, when I was reading the book, part of it that I just couldn't wrap my head around was, it wasn't like these women did it once. They didn't leave the Warsaw Ghetto one time and go to another ghetto and then stay there. They were going back and forth constantly. And just if you can just describe a little bit about what that was like, what that entailed, how did one travel hidden, posing as a Pole, but how the logistics of it was just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I love detail, and I try to get into that. I want to understand that. What these fake IDs, who made these fake IDs? Where were they from? Where's the money from? So I get into a lot of that in the book, but just to give you a sense, so someone like my main character, Renia, I'm thinking about her first. So first, the girl or young woman who was going out on the mission had to dress up. And there were different ways. Some of them dyed their hair blonde. They, scrubbed their faces with soaps that made it look a bit lighter and brighter. They borrowed clothes or bought clothes that a middle class, usually Polish woman would wear, the kind of young woman who would be out and about on the town in the middle of a war. So they had to look at a middle class or even upper middle class Polish. They dressed like they were going for a day of lunch and theater. So they had to have the clothes, they obviously makeup if they needed it. So that was the first part, was the costuming. Then they rehearsed, they practiced Christian prayers. They practiced how to speak, how to not gesticulate. Look at me here even. One tells a story about wearing a muff because that helped her control their gesticulations, which were considered very Jewish. They couldn't wear eyeglasses. Those were very Jewish. So there were particular things that they had to get physically ready for. Then they had to leave the ghetto. And it depends. There were over 400 ghettos in Poland. It's hard to generalize because they were each very different. But in this case, this ghetto was pretty loose. The boundaries weren't as, so it was finding an area without any guards and sneaking through like an opening in a gate. Some ghettos, women went through connections underground. For some of them, they left, very common, through workforces, slave labor. They would pretend to be joining a slave labor group and then peel off that group. Some of them, there were trains that ran through certain ghettos and they would sort of jump on and jump off, or even emergency vehicles that came in and out. So there were different ways of just getting in and out of the ghettos. And then they were in Aryan Poland. And of course had to keep up their composure and their act, no matter what they saw, no matter what horrific things they even overheard. They were often getting on trains, so they had these fake IDs and fake travel papers. They had to blend in. Their bags were searched. They had to distract. Sometimes they had bags full of contraband. One of my favorite anecdotes is this woman, Lanka Kajabrodska, who knew she was in trouble. She had a bag full of contraband. So she asked the Gestapo man to carry it for her because it was heavy. Taking these strategies of almost aggressive confidence in order to distract them from suspecting that she was a Jew. And I hope these are the kind of ways that they have to survive in towns and in Poland.
Yeah, I was fascinated. And the amount of walking, my feet hurt just hearing the stories of walking between ghetto. The trains only take them so far, and then they had to go to the town and not know where the ghetto is, but you can't ask where the ghetto is because that would give you away if you asked where the ghetto is. And just like, how would you, again, like just thinking through if I was in that situation, it was fascinating. You mentioned it briefly. One of the things that I thought was fascinating, like, okay, you have to get dresses, you have to get these fake IDs, you needed to go on a train, like all of this costs a lot of money. Where did the money come from? Where did the funds come from? Was it the Polish government in exile? Did the American, like who helped?
So when I first started researching this, all these stories there was money, they were buying clothes, they were carrying money, there was money in garbage. So my question was exactly this: where was the money from? So one of my first real research trips to the Holocaust Museum in DC, I met with a head researcher there. And the first question I asked him was, please show me the book about the money. Where's the book about the Holocaust and money? And he said, there's no book on the Holocaust and money. For many reasons, it's a really complicated subject. And it's also, the way that currencies worked during the war, the way that money was hidden, the businesses that were conducted. So all to say, there were two main sources where I tried to understand the story of the Holocaust and money, or money in the ghettos. One of them was through the JDC, through their archive, because the JDC gave a lot of money to Jews in Europe during the war, including about 400,000 to the underground in Warsaw. And then also reading through some of Ringelblum's archive. That's an archive of the people in Warsaw at the time in the ghetto, for those who don't know, archived their own lives for future Jews and hid them in milk jugs and buried them. And some of those have some amazing and very moving documents. And a lot of those had discussion of money, because what's more important, especially in these people were starving. A loaf of bread in the Warsaw ghetto cost what's equivalent to $60 today. So money was at the forefront of everyone's mind. They needed to eat. So people wrote a lot about money. So I took tidbits from mainly these different sources in order to try to understand where the money came from.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that was, it's amazing. It's so interesting. You do mention one of the main examples of armed resistance that a lot of people know about, which is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There was the mini uprising, as you described it, in January of 1943, and then the Ghetto Uprising during Passover in April of 1943. What role did these women play in that uprising?
So in the I can give you some estimated numbers. In the main uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that we know of from Passover 1943, numbers are difficult because we're talking about guerrilla underground operations where there were no records, no one was keeping track of this. But it appears that about 750 Jewish youths were fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and about a third of them, 250, were women. And they were combat fighters. What can we call them? Guerrilla underground fighters. They were shooting. They didn't have as many guns. They worked. Women used explosives more often. Mm-hmm. They were throwing Molotov cocktails. They were bombing Nazi tanks. One anecdote that sticks out to me is Masha Futermilk. She was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a Bundist, and she writes about, or she talked about this in a documentary. She went up to a roof because they were attacking often from the roofs, especially at the beginning, and her fingers were shaking, but she lit this match and lit the explosive, and she just heard German cries, and they were screaming, "Eine Frau kämpft, eine Frau kämpft," a woman is fighting. They couldn't believe it. The fact that she was a woman was shocking, let alone a Jew. And she was throwing. They learned techniques for how to throw these explosives. And sorry.
I know. I just think it's so fascinating because that's the one uprising, or one of the ones that most people are familiar with. It's something that a lot of people are proud of, but it's you don't usually hear the female perspective of it. And I thought that was so interesting, as the lead up to the uprising, their actions during the uprising, and then even afterwards. I mean, the very few resistance fighters who were able to survive the uprising had to get out of the ghetto, and how did they, work together to, go out through the sewer, and it was just fascinating. I think women don't get a lot of credit. So it was great to hear that side of the story.
Well, and now I need to say that one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a woman. Her name was Zivia Lubetkin. And I mean, she's in the book. I mean, just an incredible person, an incredible life story. And she was a spiritual and military leader. She was going out doing night missions, exploring the ghetto. She helped lead those survivors out through sewers and sewage water. She was a leader of the underground.
You mentioned it a little bit earlier, talking about the disguises and how you really had to prepare physically to pass as an Aryan. But something you also talk about was a lot of the mental and emotional toll that took on the women, this constant act of, they were afraid to sleep. They were afraid to get on a train and sit, because they couldn't, if the Poles were talking about something, they had to act as if they thought it was a great thing that all the Jews were being kicked out of the city. Can you explain how the women describe those experiences mentally and emotionally?
So there are stories about how they are afraid to sleep because they're afraid that they'll speak Yiddish or Hebrew in their sleep, especially if they weren't feeling well, if they had a bit of a fever. This was terrifying for them. They would give it all away. So there were instances where they forced themselves, even on these train rides that took 20 hours, not to sleep ever, because they have to stay alert, they have to stay awake, and they couldn't let the language slip for a microsecond. So that's kind of how the degree of rigor of this performance. This was life or death performance. And yeah, I mean, sometimes they'd be sitting on trains and hearing horrible things, and they would have, instances where they just witnessed someone from their family being killed. And then they would sit on a train and overhear conversations about how great it is to get rid of the Jews. And they couldn't even look sad. They just had to, they were a Catholic girl on a day out in town. And I mean, that was the degree of performance that they had to endure.
And it wasn't just one day. I think that's the part where it's like, okay, well, I can fake it. You know, I could fake it for a little while, but could you really do it consistently over an extended period of time, which a lot of these women did, which was amazing. Another story that you share the female perspective of is the Partisans in the Forest. So there, a lot of people are familiar. There was, you know, some famous movies and books about the Belinsky brothers who were in the forest and acted as Jewish partisans. And there were women, not many, but there were women who joined those groups. But that's, again, a story that's not really told that often, that the women were in the Partisans in the forest.
So apparently there were about 3,000 Jewish women involved in who were forest partisans. Again, I don't know how accurate a statistic that is, but that's kind of the most accurate statistic I could find. And yes, it was rare. And it's a complicated story because some partisans were part of Jewish detachments where women were treated differently than when women joined Soviet or Lithuanian or Polish partisan detachments. Often there, women still, they joined the partisans. There were very few of them, and they still had to pretend they weren't Jewish. So they were acting in the same degree of life and death acting, but they were also living in a forest with, I mean, this was not an easy life, partisan life. I mean, they were living in a forest with, you know, strong, brutal men with weapons. And yeah, these were incredibly strong women.
One of the other things that you touch on, which again, I don't think many people think about, is the use of sex and violence. And you talk about the sexual defense economy during the war. How can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, this was more in the partisans, and this had to do with it. Again, it's complicated, but just to talk about it briefly, there was, for you, a woman had to join the partisans. You had to either have some incredibly useful skill, or you basically became a officer's wife, a commander's wife. So he protected her, the understanding was, and she slept with him. She was his girlfriend. Often these women also were combat fighters and going on sabotage missions and helping and working with the partisans. But there was an exchange where he was the protector and she was the girl.
You also talk about sexual violation against Jewish women and the women who were hiding. You know, sometimes people would offer to hide women, and as part of the payment was not only cash, but their bodies, which was something, again, I don't know that I ever would have considered or thought about. And that's something that they had to wrestle with and grapple with.
And women also were blackmailed. You know, they call them schmaltzovniks, greasers. Schmaltz means grease, and women they blackmailed Jews and say, you know, if you pay me, 1,000 zloty, or I'm turning you into the Gestapo, who gave rewards for turning in Jews. But with women, they sometimes demanded sex, or I'll turn you in.
Yeah. Something the other you describe a lot was the malinas, the hiding places, and all the different ways and places that women and men were hidden, but especially women, because it was a little easier. And it was this interesting conversation, which is happening in Poland today, which was, were they righteous Gentiles, or were they, they got paid, and what was the motivation behind it? But I also found it so fascinating, these hiding places and having to constantly move people because they got sick, or, the person hiding them got scared. It was just amazing. And how many people it took to hide just one person. It wasn't usually just one family for the duration of the war.
Oh, yeah. And there's a book that says there's sort of 4 people. It took 4 Poles to hide one Jew. Women were at the helm of many of these rescue organizations that there were, again, the numbers are hard. They used to keep records under their watches. They would slip, I found it at Polin Museum in Warsaw. You can see the artifacts they would keep, but and even that had all fake information. It was all coded. No one could keep any information. If it was ever found, everyone would be killed and tortured. But they had charges, and they would bring, it was women in charge. They took care of, I would say a good estimate would be about 12,000 Jews in hiding just in Warsaw. And there were organizations, both Jewish and Polish, that helped them. And women were often the ones doing this work, going and talking to the landlords, the people that were hiding them, helping them find good spots, bringing them medical care, trusted doctors who wouldn't report them, bringing them trusted photographers to take photographs of them for fake IDs. Yeah.
Amazing how many people were involved.
Yes.
At the end of the war, you talk about the emotional legacy and why were the stories hidden after the war? It seemed, they wrote them down. You found Frauen in die Ghettos, which was written, I think, in 1945 or 1946. It was written in Yiddish. It was translated, but it's disappeared. And how did those stories all kind of get lost to history?
This is a big question. And in fact, I mean, for me, this was almost, they say the subtext, this is like the sub question to all my research. It was, on the one hand, what happened? What's the story? And at the same time, what happened to the story? How could I not have known this? These are big numbers. These are dramatic stories. What happened to them for all these decades? And so I did research this, and there is a bit of a section about that at the end of the book. And ultimately, I think this has to do with zeitgeist, social and intellectual zeitgeist around what we're interested in about the Holocaust in different times. There's also some political reasons around how the narratives have been shaped to tell certain stories. And this differs in Poland, in Israel, in the US as well. And then there are personal reasons. And here this has to do with women silencing themselves because they weren't believed, because they were accused of sleeping their way to safety, like with the Partisans. They were accused of leaving their families to fight instead of taking care of their parents. They had tremendous survivor's guilt, many of these women. They talk about, even though look at what they went through, but they felt that compared to survivors who had been in camps or who had been at Auschwitz, they always say they didn't have it that bad. And so they didn't feel they had the right to tell their story. And then for many of them, I think they were coping. They needed the people I write about when the war was over, they were in their early 20s. They had their whole life ahead of them. They had no family, no home, no nationality. I mean, they had to start everything from scratch. And I think for many of them, it was easier to put the past behind them to be able to move on. I think that's a story for many refugees too. They wanted to blend into their new world. And especially many of them had children, and they wanted to create normal families, happy families.
So I'm going to encourage you to put questions in our chat. I have already had a couple come in.
Sure.
Lois asked, had any of the girls been in the camps?
Yes, I write about the experience becomes different in the camps. But I write in the book about a group of 30 women at Auschwitz who collaborated they were in forced labor at Birkenau, working in a munitions plant. And they were part of an underground collaboration for several undergrounds were working at Auschwitz, and to blow up a crematorium. And these women stole gunpowder from the factory they were forced to work at in order to help blow up the crematorium. So that was more sort of within Auschwitz itself. And they did blow up that crematorium, which is a story I had certainly never heard.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. If people haven't heard that, I highly recommend it. Nancy has a question. She says, you wrote in your memoir, White Walls, that it takes 4 generations for trauma to pass through a family. Why is it 4 generations, and what message do you have for your own daughters?
Oh my goodness, you've read up on my history. I haven't talked about White Walls in a long time. I I was quoting someone else's research there. Another, I think that was a psychoanalyst theory about how trauma takes 4 generations. So I just found that interesting, and that's what I put in that book. If I remember, I wrote that a long time ago. And what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
What message do you have for your own daughters, since they would be the 4th generation? I think, is that the question? Yeah, that was the question.
I mean, what message? I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, I think that obviously I want them to feel strength from their past, and to know it and to understand where they come from, but to be able to perhaps feel less anxious about it than I do. And I mean, this goes back to how this all began. I was interested in how we handle danger and how women and Jewish women approach dangerous situations. And I want them to feel confident, knowing their past, but also able to move forward.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. Something else that people may not know, and I see it behind you, besides the edition that I have, The Light of Days, there's also a young readers
edition. Yes, I that's why I thought maybe you were asking about that, but then we went back to White Walls. This is a young readers edition. This is intended for ages 10 to 14. I wrote it with someone who specializes in young readers, nonfiction and fiction. So it's really with an eye to that audience. And it's basically the same gist of the story, but condensed. And things are slightly more explained about the Holocaust, and there's a lot less backstory, a lot less history of Poland. It's a bit more narrative. Yeah.
Great. And is that out they're both out at the same time?
Yes, they both came out yesterday.
Came out yesterday. That's so exciting. I always find it important on holidays, on Yom Hashoah, to really remember the individual names. And something that I love in the front of this book, you have, if you can kind of see it there, you have the names there. You tell a lot of stories, but you focus on a few main stories. Any little story you want to share to kind of leave with everyone tonight?
Oh my goodness. I feel like I've told you so many stories already. I need to leave something for you to go buy the book.
I know.
That's a good question. Is there something you had in mind that you wanted me to touch on?
I just, I loved Rania. I thought she was amazing. And I just, I like the sort of wrapped up at the end where you kind of, and I won't give it away, but you talk about her life after the war, how you move on, how you be this strong young female and still raise a family and live her life, and you can be joyful in those experiences. And I just think oftentimes we forget that these were individuals and they lived a life in color and they lived full experiences, and nobody was an angel and nobody was, I just find that so interesting. We have a couple other questions that came in, if that's okay.
Of course.
From Bill, Rabbi Sachs teaches us that rather than lament the past, we should use it to prepare for the future. How should we take your studies and your books to better prepare for the future?
Ooh, big questions. I hope this is a story that inspires, that shows us that, these women had nothing. And as you say, Amanda, they fought with their everything, not just once, but for months, if not years on end. They went out there and they fought the German army, the biggest armies in the world, couldn't defeat Hitler. That didn't matter. They still did it against every single odd with nothing. They fought for their convictions, for their beliefs, for freedom. And I guess that's what I would want people to take, that these acts that seem small You know, they didn't overthrow the Nazis, but still it matters. It matters to them. It mattered to the people around them. It matters to us generations later. It's meaningful. So.
Absolutely. I think that's perfect. One last question. Kathy wants to know, have you heard from any children or grandchildren of the women that you wrote about?
Oh, yes. I interviewed about 20 families. So the whole last section of the book is post-war. And as Amanda was saying, like, what happened to these women? How did they cope? How did they go on? I was very interested in that. So I met with many families, and that's the last section of the book.
That's amazing. And I loved that full circle kind of history of these women. Thank you, Judy, so much. In the chat, there are 2 separate links for the DC community and the Reading community. If you want to purchase a copy of The Light of Days, don't let the many pages scare you. I actually flew through it. It's a very engaging read. It captures you. And like I said, you'll learn a lot, and the stories they'll stick with you, which I think is so important to have something positive and uplifting at this time in our life. So thank you, Judy, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are going to end our program tonight with a name reading. The Worldwide Holocaust Memorial Project, Onto Every Person There Is a Name, is now in its 32nd consecutive year. It's a unique project that perpetuates the memory of the 6 million, among them 1.5 million Jewish children, who were murdered while the world remained silent. The project offers the opportunity to memorialize them not only as a collective, but as individuals, one at a time, through the public reciting of their names on Yom Hashoah. The most fundamental feature of the Shoah is the systematic murder of 6 million innocent Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators for the sole reason that they were Jewish. Each of their deaths was a separate, distinct tragedy. As time passes and fewer witnesses remain, it is imperative to create a personal link between people today and those who perished under the Nazi genocidal regime. Ceremonies in which the names of Holocaust victims are recited, together with such information as their age, place of birth, and place of murder, personalize the tragedy of the Holocaust. Emphasis is thus put on the millions of individuals, women, men, and children, who were lost to the Jewish people, and not solely on the cold intangibility embodied in the term, the 6 million. Onto Every Person There Is a Name rests on the success of Yad Vashem's Shoah Victims Names Recovery Project, that to date has identified close to 4.8 million names of Shoah victims and continues its quest to recover all the 6 million names. The Shoah Victims Names Recovery Project realizes our moral imperative to memorialize each victim as a human being and not merely a single collective number. Tonight, 109 names will be read by local Jewish students. If available, additional information regarding the victim will be displayed on the screen. Please take a moment to sit and reflect on these 109 individuals. They were children, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, cousins. Each has a personal familial connection to someone in the Reading Berks community, either currently or in the recent past. Lastly, I ask you to try, if you can, to remember just one individual's name tonight. Take that name, say it, remember it. The next time you remember and reflect on the Holocaust, the 6 million, remember that individual's name and say it out loud. That is how their memory will live on.
Herman Jedlitsky, Salomia Jedlitsky, Jack Jedlitsky, Abraham Wolkowitz, Regina Wolkowitz, Henry Golarski, Samuel Gordon, Izzy Gordon, Fania Gordon, Mira Niermanchinsky, Max Niermanchinsky, Izzy Niermanchinsky, Solomon Israelite, Misha Israelite, Rachel Israelite, Pacia Israelite Langbort, Mania Janoska, Minnie Engels, Hermione Pokart, Isaac Pokart, Julie Pokart, Sigmund Reiser, Regine Reiser, Emma Nussbaum, Yacheta Lepice, Esther Negroshell, Chaim Negroshell, Rachel Negroshell, Rivka Negroshell, Solomon Nadler, Lotchin Nadler, Mally Feldman Nadler, Mindale Lustrin, Phaedra Rosa Lang Lustrin, Shaija Lustrin, Matla Martz Cooperstock, Tamara Cooperstock, Rivkel Cooperstock, Chanel Cooperstock, Chana Cooperstock, Beryl Cooperstock, Adela Martz Cooperstock, Israel Meyer Cooperstock, Dina Cooperstock, Elsa Simon Gerson, Issy Simon, Carl Simon, Selma Katz Simon, Moshel Schwartz, Leisha Schwartz Stetchler, Nusen Schwartz, Moshi Stetchler, Mary Potasnik Cooperman, Jacob Potasnik, Ingeborg Borkowski, Hildy Human Borkowski, Simon Samuel Borkowski, Sarah Zalk Potasnik, Naftali Borkowski.
Katriza Steiner, Fanny Singer, Helene Abdella, Bernard Frankel, Ida Frankel, Therese Frankel, Keith Waldman, Leo Frankel, Anna Schwarz, Elizabeth Fleischhacker, Marianne Frankel, Paulina Singer, Julius Judah Singer, Irina Singer, Bella Schwartz, Friedrich Frankel, Magda Ballach, Vilmos Frankel, Elena Lilo, Mandler, Zofia Pollack, Wilhelm Winter, Julie Sauerwinter, Alfred Sauer.
Gusta Reese, Michael Schmagic, Carl Bernkla, Lucia Hirschhorn, Bernard Schmagic, Hana Schmagic, Phoebe Schmagic, Frida Schmagic, Gusta Bernkla, Herman Drimmer, C. Drimmer, Israel Drimmer, Bobby Rottenberg, Else Bratt, Erwin Bratt, Heinz Bratt, Irma Bratt, Bertha Bratt, Elsa Kishkover, Eugene Hasek, Hohen Hasek, Lucy Hasek, Alice Stein, Heinz Stein, Walter Stein, Ernst Stein.
Thank you. I hope you remember just one of those names and hold it and say it, and their memories may be a blessing. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and take care.